Welcome to Oregon Voters Digest, the program that brings forward the social and political issues that are important to people living here in the Pacific Northwest. And now, your host, Bruce Broussard.
Welcome again to this segment of the Oregon Voters Digest. I'm Bruce Broussard, your host. And folks, I guess you know we're having some major issues throughout the country, and even right here in the Portland metropolitan area, or more particularly Oregon as a whole. I mean, it looked like every time we turn around, we're in the media. I mean, we're always there. And I noticed at the latest, there were some other things there. But like I said, what we're going to do now, we're going to focus here again in the Portland metropolitan area. It's the largest district in the state of Oregon, and we're right in the midst of Portland, Oregon, if you will. And our guest tonight will be Steve Buel. Steve, at one point in time, used to be on the school board. In fact, he was there a second time. I mean, he's been here quite some time. And in fact, you've seen Steve here on the Oregon Voters Digest on numerous occasions, whether it be running, whether we're running for the school board or any other issues. Steve was there. He's really an authority, and he goes back quite a ways. So if you want to see more of his shows, you can look at the historical part of the Oregon Voters Digest, and you can catch him on all sorts of subject matter. But what we're going to do this particular segment, we're going to spend about 30 minutes with Steve, and he's just going to kind of do an overview of several areas. One, as you know, the school district, education is key in the entire election aspect of it, very important. As you know, we got the pandemic aspect of it, COVID-19, and we've been going through some changes here in the state of Oregon from the standpoint of when can people get those, when they can get the serum in the arm. And now there was a situation between the seniors and the kids, and then the seniors basically were leading, and then all of a sudden now the kids are leading in the school district, and they're going to be doing that piece. Plus, we have issues now with the teachers. The teachers are having some problems from the standpoint of whether or not they want to go back and attend. So what happens to the kids if the teachers are not there? So we got some major issues. Plus the fact, because Steve is a resident of Portland, we've asked him to basically comment, if you will, on the situation of Portland. He remembered Portland when it was the city of roses, a beautiful place to live and reside, whatever. So hopefully he can share with us that particular situation and anything else that's on his mind. I think it's going to be very fruitful, if you will, the information. And as I indicated to you before, our whole focus is to try to educate you. We want to educate you about those issues, about what the issues are, and hopefully you can call those responsible leaders or elected officials who are responsible, if you will. And that's including the school board and our city official and our state official. Trust me, we've got to be at the table. And that's one of the main reasons why I've interviewed Steve in the past for so many times, because he has the information, but he also has the solutions. And I think that. Welcome aboard, Steve. How's it go?
Thank you.
Okay, good.
Overly nice introduction, Bruce. They probably don't know that you and I sat at the school board meetings like in 1975 together.
Yes.
So we go back a long ways.
Very much so. Thanks, Steve. So let's just get right on into some of those points that we talked about.
Well, let's start with the shortest one.
Okay.
Which is the city. I've been holed up like most 75-year-old men, maybe, who live alone in my condo, and I decided, okay, I'll drive down through the city and see how it's doing for the first time in a long time. And I was absolutely flabbergasted. It was horrible. It was 10 times worse than I'd imagined. It was garbage every place. People, tents on the sidewalks, on major streets. It's terrible. If people haven't been down there, it's unbelievable. But so I thought, okay, I'm going to find out what they're doing. How are they going to go about cleaning this up? What's the plan? And so I started calling. I've paid attention to the newspaper and looked for a plan. I haven't seen anything. I started calling people on the city council. I've been through 3. There's no plan, no step-by-step plan where they go, okay, here's the budget, here's what we're doing, here's how long it's going to take us. There isn't anything like that. It's I was just, it's unbelievable to me, because there are things you could do. I would think what you could do is you could take it a certain number of blocks, maybe 8 blocks at a time, and clean them up one by one all the way down the street. And then you have to figure out what you're going to do with those late night protests that are not really protests, that are basically vandalism, the late night ones, that like the Black United Matter, the VLM protests are terrific, but the late night ones are just, they're destroying the city, and you need to figure out how to stop that. And man, at least you have a plan. They don't have one, and it really, I just think it's really a disaster with no plan. How long is it going to take to fix it up? A year, 2 years, 3 years? You could take a plan, put it together, and do it in a couple months. So that's what I think about downtown.
Okay.
And when I call, it's kind of interesting when I called, they don't really, like the mayor's office now, in the middle, I called several times trying to talk to anybody in the mayor's office, no. And now the mayor came out today, this morning when I made the call, he came out and he's got a new thing where it says, hey, basically it says, we probably won't call you back. Or it said, we'll call you back as soon as we can, but now they're not even calling you back. So it's hard to say. It just seems like really short-sighted work by the city council. And like I say, I've lived in Portland since 1974, and it just doesn't make any sense. The other thing that I think is the other thinking spot that I'm a little different than people are is you have this huge homeless problem that needs to have really increased solutions, really directed at it. But it's not the same as the downtown. You can put together a plan for a certain area downtown and actually do it, whereas the homeless situation is totally different. You need to have some place for people to go, but you don't have to have them on the streets in downtown, for one thing, and you don't have to have garbage all over the place, which they have when I drove through. You can get the windows back in the buildings. You could do all that. You don't have to solve the entire homeless problem, which is a national problem, before you do that. You can just go there. So that's my feeling on that. And I didn't have any success on the phone, really. People just said, no, they don't have a plan. Oh, we're planning to clean up the graffiti, or we're planning to do something with the homeless, maybe. And in some cases, they justified. Lady in Hardesty's office, basically, I said, well, you got a person on the sidewalk with a tent on 4th Street. So can the person be in a different place with a tent than on the sidewalk on 4th Street downtown? She said that if they tried to move that person to a different spot or help them move to a different spot, that person would die. Literally said that, and she'd die. The person would die. Well, I pointed out to her that you have hundreds and hundreds of people all over Portland not camping on in the middle of the city on 4th Street, and they're not dead. And that, it just seems like it's time to take some action in that. And it's a lot of talk and action. I normally haven't really paid real careful attention to the city council, but this just seems like a huge breach of it's a mess, and they should work it out. I think they could. Heck, I'll give them a plan. Heck, they could call you. You'd probably give them a plan. It just seems kind of crazy. That's not school stuff, but that's my feelings on it.
Well, real quick, before you get to the third piece, I want you to know that we are going to be covering maybe possibility and maybe the rationale as to why the mayor isn't talking to him. He just picked up a new staff, and we're going to discuss that in the next half hour of the show. Jack did some work on that piece, so you know what I'm saying. So anyways, I just want to throw that in.
On them. It's just you drive down through town and you go, what's the plan to clean this up? And then when you call to find out, they don't have one. They ought to have.
Yeah.
And it should have a timeline and step by step what they're doing, and it should have a reasonable chance of success. But they don't have that.
Okay, well, you'll be part of the audit. I think that's going to be what we're going to be. So we'll be part of the audit, and you'll probably be on the committee, get the Oregon Voters Digest,
Yeah.
to talk about it. Okay, go ahead on, Steve. I'm just holding on for you. Go on.
The coronavirus
Yep.
In the schools, the coronavirus in the schools.
Portland Public Schools, right?
Well, Portland Public Schools.
And the state, right?
The state, right? It's a little different, obviously, where you go. The thing that has struck me is you've got the head of the Oregon Education Association saying, no, don't do it to teachers first. We're not ready to go back. Do the older people who are dying, the people who are dying, about 90% of the people who are dying are older, and do them for, even the OEA is saying that. So I was like flabbergasted when the governor moved the teachers ahead of people who are dying. I have a lot of older friends, 88, 93, who, if they get COVID, it's really serious problems. But so to do all the teachers first with the idea that the kids are going to go back, where they don't really have a plan for kids going back anyway, that seems to work. It just doesn't make sense. It didn't make sense to me. I thought it was a mistake. I talked to people in the Portland Teachers Union, and they felt it was a mistake. Most of the teachers I talked to think, no, that's not the direction to go. Do those older people who are going to die first. If they get COVID, that good chance of dying, and then move to the teachers. And when you're able to get kids back to school anyhow, I wouldn't. Would you send a grandchild of yours to school right now? I don't think I would. I wouldn't send a. I have lots of these great nieces and nephews. I wouldn't advocate for any of them to go back. Portland is a little different than some other places because the buildings are way older and the rooms are smaller, and so it's difficult. You get a rainy day and stuff, and you're not outdoors. So you can't really load up those rooms. They're smaller and older, and they don't have great ventilation, and they're not smaller. So solving those problems and doing it in an intelligent way, I thought would make more sense if they'd really dealt with what needs to be dealt with right now, and then move from there. Not that some kids aren't suffering, but hey, there's a lot of kids suffering. And I think it's terrible and it's horrible that it is. But I'll give them a whole lot of ideas if they really want to limit the suffering for children. A lot of things they could do in Portland Public Schools educationally that they've done and haven't done. So, they're really that interested in it. I heard Andrew Scott talk about how bad it is, and it is, for kids not going back to school. But, well, Andrew, how about taking care of the disproportionate way that they handle programs in Portland for children of color, for poor children, versus how they handle it for other children? Want to talk about that? I'd be more than happy to talk about that. So sometimes I think there's a little hypocrisy over the whole thing to some degree. You got a school board that I think you really have 7 nice people on the school board. They're pretty nice people. But, the last time that the kind of well-to-do community in Portland didn't control the school board for their own ends to a huge degree was way back when Matt Prava was superintendent 30 years ago. And so there's a lot of problems in the schools that they could address and that don't get addressed. And they're not very responsive. And the new superintendent, not very responsive guy on that stuff anyway. He's got, I think I sent him 60 emails. I've never gotten one back. Never gotten a response for at least 60 emails for a long time. A lot of things on issues and so forth. He's just doesn't seem like a responsive guy. He worries about what's going on in Baltimore more than he worries about what's going on in a school in Portland. And the school board hasn't held him very accountable for that. And they've hired a lot of people that I don't think are particularly nice people, but they have some great ones too, that they could really do stuff. The new woman she's not brand new, but she's the new person who's head of the ESL. She's excellent. She talked to me for an hour and a half about ideas that I had, what you could do for ESL students to make it work better for them. And normally you just get a hands up, hey, I don't want anything to do with it. No. And a guy by the name of Cuellar is a terrific guy. and he really cares about kids. So they've got the potential to really care about children and fix things. And people, I'm not thinking now. I'm paid. I haven't been hassling anybody in the schools now because it's too hard. I mean, it's harder to teach from home than it is to teach at school. 100 times harder, practically. And so I kind of stayed off them. But when they come back, they got to be ready to go again. And before the coronavirus, they weren't ready. They didn't have the school system. There were a lot of things that had even previous boards had done that they overturned that would have made a lot of difference to how the system works. And so I'm hoping they'll figure that out as they go forward. We've had a huge decline in Portland schools. If you did a great interview with Matt Prophet way back in about 1990 when he was leaving. And one of the things I remember in that interview, he said they had done the African American, the black children in Portland were reading at 56% of the national average in 1990 or 91. And they were doing mathematics, the black children in Portland, doing mathematics at 48% of the national average. Now, last I had heard, black children were at 21% reading instead of 56, and they were at 9% in math. Now, there must be something that they were doing back in the 1980s that's different than what they're doing in the 2019. There must be something. They might take a look at that and see. I mean, you drop in that period of time from 56% in Portland, and a lot of the African American children have moved east because there's been a huge number. So actually, you've really got a better setup economically for African American children probably now than you used to back when in 1990. So there are things that they could do, they're just not doing. And it's too bad. It's too bad, but no, that's just the way the system works now.
Okay, Steve, one of the things I'd like for them to hear from you is that when you were at Portland, you actually dealt in two areas. You retired from Portland Public Schools in Portland, Oregon, and then you went to Washington, and you went there for a spell, and then you came back and you ran for the school board. You ran for the school board and you won. During that particular time,
helping me out.
Was that okay, buddy?
The teachers union helping me out.
Exactly. We had quite a time, by the way, during that time. Why don't you share with them, one, what did you see when you got back on the board? And at the same time, because you now, besides that you're elected to office, what did you see that you felt needed something? And then what did you see at the end of the day from the standpoint of what you had done as to what you had said they had picked up and followed up with some of the things to improve the system? Because Portland Public School was identified as the lowest, as far as lowest grading average and whatever, and graduations throughout the entire state.
Well, when I first came back on the board, the school board and the teachers were at odds with each other.
Okay.
They didn't say it out in public, but in the back rooms in the school board members that were there that went in 2013 to 15, they said the teachers were the enemy. And that got changed after some of those people left the board. And so we started working with the teachers, but it's still, the things that, say, Paul Anthony was on the board with me for a couple of years, and actually Tom Curler to some degree, I never really could get 4 votes. You could only get 3, so you really couldn't do what you wanted to do. But we did do some really important things that we started, and a lot of them had to do with, like, when Yusef Awad was superintendent, we set up a committee that was going to develop equality in the way that schools were staffed, the elementary schools, not the high schools, but the elementary schools, equality, which they don't have now. Now, if you're in a more well-to-do neighborhood, you get a better deal of the staffing in your school. And if you're in a poor neighborhood, you get a worse deal. I mean, heck, they even cut the grass different if you go around and drive all over town and look. And so but we had set out a system that was going to change that. There's two major problems. One is the equity in the regular classrooms in terms of what programs they have. Do we have PE? What do we have in our school that's the same as in other schools? They all should be the same. If you're a fifth grader and you have PE in one school, you have PE in every school. Not in foreign public schools, it doesn't work exactly like that. And the second part is that they have terrible inequity in the special programs like special reading and ESL. And we were going to change that. And we started a committee that set up within a couple of years, because you had to go after the budget first, really. And within a couple of years, we were going to have all that changed. And these huge inequities you have in the school, where you can go to one school and it's a lot worse than another school, and then the kids in the fifth grade in one school and fifth grade in another. And the new superintendent and the new school board that came in then, under Julia Bream Edwards, dumped that committee. They dumped it. They just dumped the whole thing. And they've never addressed those problems. And they never set up a way that you can even address them. So you can't even tell by looking. Like if you decided, okay, I'm going to work on this problem, and so Bruce Broussard went in and he got all the information he could possibly do, still couldn't fix the problem, because you can't tell from their stuff even who hired, where did this teacher come from? Was he or she hired in the 8%? Was Title I? Was it how it worked? You can't, literally, it's a mess. It's such a mess. In fact, I talked to an administrator yesterday, I think it was, and I said, you can't really tell. And she starts laughing. She knew you couldn't tell. And so how do you compare where you can get $200,000 extra in your school up in the West Hills that you raise, and you can buy a couple extra teachers? How can you compare that? And you can't do it. And when you look, you can find these discrepancies in places, but you can't compare the whole system to see if your school is getting a rotten deal. And some schools are, and you really can't lay it out. And we were going to fix that, and they took care of. Another thing that we were that I was really working on was hiring teachers of color. And I had a system set up, and I got them to do the first steps of it, but they wouldn't finish it, which would have hired a lot more and outstanding young teachers of color in Portland. And everybody gripes about that. Well, here's a plan. But I tried to give it to the new HR lady who's there, the one who came on after I left. Not interested at all. Couldn't care less about that. And then I tried to set up a system where you can get multicultural education things into your classroom, because teachers are hugely busy. And people don't understand. It's really hard to just do one new lesson kind of during the whole year almost. So if you're going to ask people to teach multicultural education and do it well, you need to have a place where teachers can go. Well, I had that all set up. The budget was there, everything. So we were going to have a website where teachers could go to get information, and could actually get a person who would research for them to get stuff for them to help them with multicultural education. New people dumped that. Brilliant young guy that we had brought in to do that, and he's still working, but he's not doing that. They dumped that stuff. It's just, there were a lot of things that we did right at the end that ended up getting dumped, or they wouldn't quite follow through with. So it was very disappointing the first year, particularly when I was off the school board. And here's the things that we had really worked on. Well, for instance, they're slow. Remember Lincoln said of McClellan in the Civil War, he said he has the slows. Well, that's kind of what it is, both in city council, I think, and in the school board. They have the slows. We had, in 2017, before I went off, we had set up, and we're going forward to doing an ethnic studies program in high school. So every kid would have the opportunity to take ethnic studies in high school if they wanted. And that came out of one of the community organizations, and I kind of took it and ran with it, and then handed it off to one of the other board members who then was running with it. But when I went off the board, it's now 4 years later.
Wow.
Ethics stuff.
Wow. Tell you what we're going to do, Steve. Tell you what we're going to do. We're going to take a short break, but my point is, if you can stay around, because I know we're already committed to 30 minutes, but if you can stay around for another 5 minutes, it would be great. Can you do that, maybe? Okay, good. Okay, folks, we're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back, okay? Please tell your friends. Join us. Welcome back, folks, to the Oregon Voters Digest. We took this short break, but hey, we're back on now. And as you know, we was interviewing Steve Buel, former Portland School Board member and elected official and all this kind of good stuff. But the whole idea is that we were getting some points across. And so Steve's going to be with us for a few more minutes. And if not that, he's going to be here for the rest of the show. So what we're going to do, we're going to start where we sort of ended up with Steve and let him raise some other points that he wanted to share with us. And then we'll just get into a meeting, a gathering, if you will, between Jack, Steve, and I and you. Okay? So with that, Steve, welcome aboard. Jack, nice seeing you. Okay, good. Okay, Steve.
I'll just kind of maybe summarize a little bit what I said pretty quickly. Read a book called The Power Paradox.
Okay, good. Good
What
one.
it talks about is how we gain and lose influence, and it talks about how people get influence, like an elected official, school board member, school council, a school board member or a city council member, and they get in because of their empathy, their kindness, their intelligence, how they're showing that they care about the community, the children, or the people in the community. And once they get in, there's often a big, huge shift where no longer are they as empathetic. And you can see that if you look at the school board. And you can see, okay, what's important to them now? It's not the same thing as when they first got going. It's a lot about the administration and about what goes on at the school board, but the children are getting lost in, and it's a typical thing. It's gone on for years and years in Portland. And what goes along with that, I think, is that you get interested in other things which are not within your sphere. For instance, in the school board, really what your job is to take care of, make the schools work and to take care of children. But they move into, okay, what becomes important is like the CBOs, the community organizations and so forth, which are great. You want to partner with them. They're terrific. You want to get help, but they're not what makes the school go. And it's the same kind of with this downtown cleanup that I talked about earlier. You're cleaning up downtown. You don't get anything cleaned up by sitting down and talking with people. What you need is a little leadership where you make a plan. You can take the plan out and have people comment on it, but you're not going to clean it up by just sitting around and talking. It's one reason that we haven't made much of a dent in the homeless situation is because a lot of talking, but not really a plan and then put it into work. So that's it for me. Summary.
Okay, good. In fact, why don't we just kick it off right there with reference to the plan? We've been talking about the plan, and actually we just started the Zoom situation here on Oregon Voters Digest. And if you notice, it's sort of changed a little bit. You dotted the I's and whatever, crossed the T's, and I'm not bobbing, if you will, and Steve's not he's the man in the background. And so we're getting to the point now that we can communicate. And so I say that to say that these are very important points that we're trying to get across and educate the public. Educate the public. That's one of the main things that we're having problem with as far as a fix it, if you will. We've got to educate them about what is the plan. Got me? And as you say, Steve, we don't have a plan. And let me kick off by saying, we've got this mayor, in all due respect, who's been around kicking it for the last 12 years in politics. He spent 4 years at the county. He spent 4 years as the treasurer, and he spent 4 years mayor previously. So that's 12 years, plus the fact the guy is from Portland, Oregon. He's from Oregon. and he's a millionaire, if you will. You know what I mean? And there's just so much time one can spend OJTing the job, but at some point in time, you have to be able to perform. And I think there's a problem there. And so the mayor's office, as you know, we don't have any consolidation, if you will, between the county and the city. We got two separate entities. However, the city is kind of like the leading force behind the whole issue of homelessness, if you will. Okay, I mean, and he's calling all the shots. And just getting right into the matter, because I want to bring Jack involved in the process. As you know, he was just recently elected. He was just recently elected again, a second time, this second time around, because he had to go through a runoff. But you notice in the runoff that, again, here's the problem. One of the problems, all three major players, major newspapers, including some of the other media, all supported him. They endorsed him. They endorsed him completely. And here we are now. We've got someone talking about a recall. We've got a gentleman, he's in the recall right now as we speak, and still having those major problems down city. And people can use some of the discussions we've had in the past, Steve, here on the Zoom show. But the bottom line is still going the same. As you said, we don't have a plan. Now today, and I'm going to bring Jack in right now, and then we can just kind of go through the discussion, and hopefully you might, if you want to, you can just join right on in. Jack just basically said that just recently it was published that he has a new staff. And right before that, Sam Adams, as you know, is a mayor, was a mayor at one point in time, and worked many years with Derek Katz, if you will. And but the bottom line is that we thought maybe he was, if you will, the new chief of staff. Now I'll bring Jack on. Is my understanding he is now not the chief of staff presently. There's a new chief of staff, but also there's some other members. Again, no plans. Okay? So Jack, why don't you just come on in and just go from there and go wherever you want to go with that piece, okay? All right?
Well, Bobby Lee will become Mayor Ted Wheeler's new chief of staff effective February 22nd. He has some background working in the city and county in different type of economic redevelopment. But it's also been announced that Mayor Wheeler has appointed Sam Adams, former Mayor Sam Adams, as a director of strategic innovation. And I think certainly Steve is very, very intelligent. And the encouraging sign I see is the fact that, whenever I've led large organizations, I wanted to try and get the best and the brightest people I could around me to try and give me alternative ideas to try and solve the problems we have. And from that standpoint, in my interaction with Adams when he was running for city commissioner against Mingus Matz and Chloe Daly, he clearly had insight and was very intellectual person. And he and I had some interesting discussions about how to address some of the issues that had not been thought of by Commissioner Udaley. And also Mayor Wheeler is bringing on Markeisha Smith, Dr. Smith, as a special advisor on racial justice and equity. And she obviously has she has an exceptional resume. And so I think as long as he listens and seeks their advice and listens to their counsel, that's encouraging. But Steve, I'll make one point that you raised, and that is about having a plan and trying to be, there was a term I used to use when I was in business, don't study for the wrong test. And sometimes people get into a position and they focus on the wrong items. And yes, in political office, they may be very empathetic and they may be able to communicate, but their ability to analyze different aspects and to make decisions sometimes can be very flawed. I find it interesting that you raised the question about the COVID virus. As of yesterday, Oregon had, our per capita rates of COVID are very low compared to other states, but we had 1,930 deaths in our state. But of those, 1,650, almost 90%, were those people that were 65 or older. So the question you have is the CDC the Disease Control Center, the federal government, has certain recommendations that, based on primarily age and their prioritization and distribution of the vaccine. But Governor Brown has taken a different position. She's saying we also want to get the students and the teachers vaccinated and bump them ahead of the people that are 65 and older. So what she's saying is that the trauma and the negative experiences the students have working from home is a higher priority than saving lives. The risk of fatalities for that age group will be significantly less. But we're not talking about death rates. She doesn't want to put that out there. She wants to talk about the fact that I want to help the children. Well, we all want to help the children. But the question is, it's a difficult problem, how you achieve the best results, how you get our COVID numbers down, our infection rates down, maximize the recovery for people from that standpoint. It's not an easy problem, and I'm not trying to make it sound like that she is completely off base. But the problem I have is when she tries to communicate her decision, she's not presenting it in a factual and analytical way. And I think, to be fair, that's what needs to happen. And we need factual analytical plans to address the homeless, to address the downtown. A recent article in the Oregonian said that foot traffic in the downtown was down by more than 80% from the previous year. And that people, the vast majority of the people they interviewed, no longer feel safe going downtown. Now, what that's telling you is the city is effectively, it's not COVID. It's part of the riots, it's part of the graffiti, it's part of the destruction, it's part of the homeless populations downtown. And what's happening is many of these businesses are moving out to the suburbs, Lake Oswego, Hillsborough, Beaverton, where they feel safer, where they feel that it's a better run and a more efficient city, which is a shame because our city of Portland, where I live, used to be one of the most beautiful cities in the world. And I've lived in a lot of places around the world. So, and also in Northeast Portland, the Lloyd Center is a ghost town, and the directors and the owners of the few businesses that are left said the Lloyd Center is dying. It's terminal, it's on life support, and it will take a miracle to reinvigorate and to bring businesses back to the Lloyd Center, which will hurt the community. So from that standpoint, the devastation that's going on by mismanagement, by lack of plans, by lack of coordination, by lack of collaboration, it's absolutely heartbreaking because it's hurting people, and it will also hurt the tax base, which means the resources for the schools, resources for the food bank programs will also be curtailed and hurt.
Okay.
Exactly.
Steve, what do you think?
Well, yeah, right on the button. You know, another thing you can look at is the tourism. Would you bring an NCAA tournament here? Would you bring your convention here right now? Would you be a tourist here? I have this wonderful, very nice woman who I'm now going with, and she tells stories about coming up from California and how wonderful it was to go just downtown Portland. She'd go stay at a hotel with a friend down on the river and walk around, and it was just marvelous. Gee, my knee. I literally would not take a young child downtown with me. I'm not fearful when I go down there, but it's a mess, and they're not figuring out what they need to do. You could clean that place up in about 2 months with a reasonable budget. You could raise huge amounts of money to clean it up if you need when you needed it. You could. There's tons of things you can do, but they're just talking and talking and talking.
Well, there's another point to realize too, is that I find that we as a city don't look at other cities, what has worked and what hasn't worked. The city of San Antonio, which is much larger than Portland, it's about 1.25 million people. 10 years ago, they had anywhere between 800 and 1,000 people that were homeless downtown. And they started a program actually by the private sector, not run by the city or run by the state, the private sector called Haven for Hope. And they were taking in about 1,000 to 1,200 people a year and running at about an 85% success rate, getting the people off the streets and back in a productive life. And the number of homeless has now dropped from 800 or more down to less than 100 right now, which from a standpoint of businesses and people and feeling safe, it has completely reinvigorated the downtown area of San Antonio. So we need to look at what analogs have been used by other cities. And I think that's definitely the case for trying to help the homeless and address the homeless problem, which clearly is a national problem. And we need to be examples for other cities of successes, not examples of cities that are failing.
You know, gentlemen, in all due respect, when you start thinking about when did all this started, you'd mentioned, Jack, about Homer Williams, who was basically running the program. He was the leading proponent here in the city and had a plan, if you will. But unfortunately, that's who we started off, who we elected. His name was Ted Wheeler. He had no background whatsoever. You know, in fact, I knew the Marine that was sitting up there at Homer's office. You know, and my point is that they did have a plan. And in fact, during that particular time, we had the jail situation, if you will, with reference to the jail situation up in North Portland. Okay, remember that? Okay, and that property we sold, that property was worth $100 million. We sold it for $5 million. Okay, we sold it for $5 million, and in fact, we needed all those beds. We needed all those beds. And what I mean by that, during that particular time, we needed those beds. The sheriff's office had to rent beds. The sheriff's office had to rent beds. And actually, as a result of that, he had to rent beds and let individuals off the hook, if you will, release them, if you will, because we didn't have the beds. But we had the whole issue with the park. She was that name, just doesn't come with me, the jail facility that I'm talking about. But bottom line, we got it, and now today, remember now, the building was sold to an entity for $5 million, and the entity brought in another entity outside of this community. And we've got expert people here locally that could have responded to making sure that we use those beds. A so-called commitment from the new entity of 250 beds. Guess what? Not even half of those beds are occupied. Not even half. But no one talks about it. So you ask yourself the question, who is the leading force?
Well, with all due respect, Bruce, I think you've got to recognize the Bobby Lakes program does have a system in place.
No, Jack.
Then you and I disagree on that.
Well, we totally disagree on that point. I'm saying the commitment was 250 beds. He doesn't have the 250. He's got less than half of that.
That's what I'm trying to explain to you, is the fact that he has a process, and one of the processes is to make sure that anyone that comes in doesn't have COVID. So that's part of the process as well.
Okay. Well, we disagree on that piece.
Well,
I'm saying Homer Williams should have been a part of the whole deal. See what I'm saying? A lot of politics on this crap. See, got me?
Well, actually, Homer is part of. He's actually on the board, I believe, with Bobby Lake.
No, he's not.
I think you're. I'm sorry.
All right. Let's get Steve involved here. No problem.
One thing that you can both agree on is if you're going to ask someone who's camping on 4th Street downtown to not camp on 4th Street downtown, then you have to have they're going to need to go camp someplace else. And in the long run, with the homeless people in Portland, you need to camp for those people. Not you can just say, okay, you can't camp here, but you got 20 people camping up on the freeway on ramp, and you want to ask them, okay, to go camp someplace else. You have to have a place for them to go.
Exactly.
Period. You can't ask otherwise. You go down. I went down Powell once, counted 57 tents. Well, if you don't want them there, then where are they going to go? We are so slow on that, and people agree with that. I mean, Dan Ryan, he agrees with that 100%. We need to have a place for people to go,
exactly,
where they can be safe and where they can camp at this point in time, at least as the transition point. You have to do it in a humane, intelligent way, but you can't camp on 4th Street. Heck, you can't even put a sandwich board out on 4th Street without going through a process.
Let's talk a little bit about the school district a little bit more. How do you think that situation is going to resolve itself?
Which part of it?
As far as the as far as the students, between the students and the school board, and no, the school teachers association?
Well, it's hard to predict how that's going to come out. You've got the COVID is so difficult and so new and so few people who are dealing with it. I mean, how do you know how it's going to come out? I don't think you can. You can keep, if they do a hybrid system, which a lot of school districts are going to, the kids go a couple days a week and they spread them out. Because if you got
Right.
all the children in the schools aren't big enough to put them all in and keep them spread out.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you have a hybrid system, you can do that. But the problem, a lot of the problem is not so much the children themselves, or if the school teachers have had the vaccination, then it's not so much the problem there. The problem is going home. And a lot of children have extended families at home, all living together. And so you go home and your grandparents live in the same place. You get COVID in
Right.
school, you go home. It's just not, they're not quite there yet, in my opinion. They need to take a little more time and to get a better handle on how the COVID is going to work out. I just think I'm for pushing for it, but I'm not sure. I'll go with most of the teachers I know and say, no, we're not quite ready to go back. In which case, they should have been vaccinating the older people. Even if they, even if I'm biased, maybe it's an older
I was
person.
going to ask you.
You can look out there and say, oh, this guy's an older person,
exactly.
he's biased. But
Exactly.
even if they didn't do me, I would have them do everybody else.
Yeah. Well, as you know, politics plays a major role in everything that's happening even right now. With a newly elected president now, and you got the former president still around, if you will, and they're dealing with this issue. And that was really not a plan then at that point in time, if you will. One plan for all states, for all kids, right? Even on the COVID standpoint. So they're still in a divided deal. I think Biden is trying to do a one-stop piece and go across the board, but he's just kind of agreeing and disagreeing, but he's trying to dot the I's and cross the T's to make sure that we don't miss anybody. I noticed that the state of New York, the governor of New York is they're dealing politics along that line, talking about a few older folks that died, something of that nature, right? I mean,
one of the interesting things I think about national educational politics is Biden has a new person, got rid of Betsy DeVos, brought in a new
okay.
person. I can't say his name, but I've read his, the background on him, and he's way better than, because he comes from public education. But what a lot of people forget is that if you go back before Trump to Obama, as good as Obama was as a president, he was not very good on educational stuff. He pushed the corporate educational plans that have done a lot to mess up education in like all the way across the country, including in Oregon, the testing, the over-testing, and so forth, and let's all be accountable and instead of a good, solid, well-rounded education, which in my opinion is much more important. And we've seen to some degree the lack of education in a lot of people who just, you listen to what they, how they're talking about things and how they're talking about history, and you're going, didn't they go to school? Where did we mess up with a lot of the people who are now coming out in America and going, hey, this isn't believing all of the conspiracy theories. I have a friend who thinks that, absolutely believes we never went to the moon. I mean, but there's tons of people like that, not putting it together with some reason. Now, I'm not saying that educated people are really better than that. I'm saying that all the people in America have gone through the educational process.
Right.
We obviously have missed with some, to some degree, and I think a lot of it has been the corporate education reform stuff in the last 20 years, particularly since about 2003. that they really started going on it. And so it's a national problem too that goes almost unrecognized now, because the superintendents of the superintendents of big cities, larger cities, let's say, like let's take Eugene, say, in Portland and so forth, they came up and became superintendents as they moved up through the last decade or two. They were maybe a principal or assistant principal, junior administrator, superintendent. And those people came up in the testing stuff, and they didn't get up the line unless they believed in the testing. They didn't get up the line saying, oh, this testing really is really bad, which it is in a lot of ways. They didn't get up the line saying that. They get up because that's where all the education was going, see? So that Common Core, the testing, the accountability things, those aren't necessarily helpful. And the other thing that has kind of changed to some degree, that's had a negative aspect in some areas, particularly in Oregon, is the way that they're dealing now with helping children in school who are having trouble. And for instance, if you throw a let's call it a temper tantrum in the classroom, it used to be that they came in and somebody took you out of the classroom and the class went on, where you went out and they worked with you, counseled you, and so forth and so forth. Now what they do often, not always, but often, they'll take the whole class out and leave you in the classroom to throw the temper tantrum and to bust stuff up or to break stuff and so forth and so forth. Nobody really, and that doesn't help those children, really, because where can you do that in society? If somebody comes up and starts busting up your studio, or where can if a kid I saw a kid once throw a tantrum kind of in Bed Bath and Beyond. They put the kid outside. They didn't take all the other people in Bed Bath and Beyond outside and let the kid throw the temper tantrum, which is what we were teaching. So to some degree, the educational process has gotten messed up, and it's hopefully we'll get some better leadership, because the last 12 years have been pretty bad at the federal level in trying to get that type of good education going for people, and it's been tough. It's been tough. Portland struggled with it. They're not struggling now because they're over testing again.
Let me throw this out to you too, and I think we're all sort of like we're at that point right now. We're having a major discussion on the masses, if you will, the grown-ups, if you will, and the more articulate part of our communities are in the same vein. And this whole idea of half of in this last political election aspect of it, 50% Republican, 50% Democrat. You hear nothing about the other so-called other entities like the libertarians and this, that, and other. But the 50%, and they're constantly making the point about 75 million on one side and 74 on the other, something like that aspect. And I'm thinking points that you were making in regards to the superintendents and whatever, like states are divided now. You got me? And so all of a sudden, if one entity says, well, we think kids should go this way, we should do this in the classroom, you got the other entity that said, no, we don't need to do it this way. We need to do it this way. How do we deal with that, Steve?
Boy, I wish I knew. I would be probably, I would have been maybe the head of education instead of the, yeah, I don't have a solution for that. I do think that in education, you can come together much easier. In other words, it's hard to find somebody that doesn't think a kid should learn to read well, or who doesn't think a kid should learn mathematics, and even science, music, all those. About the only place where that comes into play in education is in history. And Trump had that big history deal, which Biden came in and got rid of, because the history, what bothers me about it, and the education, because I was talking about the educational piece, the national one, what bothers me is history and government are different. Now, one influences the other, of course, but government is how it works right now. What is the law? When I was teaching in middle school, in Lane Middle School, back in the 90s, and Measure 12 came in, the law was if you got mad at a friend and you pushed him and took his basketball and took it home, and you were 15 years old or so, then you ended up maybe, I can't remember, it's 5.5 years in prison for taking the kid's basketball and pushing him, which is, I mean, that's where we went. And so the teaching people what government is and how it works is not the same as history and how history has gone on. And so when there's a move now to do social justice in the schools, and that's a good thing, but it shouldn't replace teaching government, and it should fit in with history, but it shouldn't replace teaching government, which we've kind of moved away from, because a lot of people evidently don't like to teach it to some degree. But I think that's had a huge impact, because people don't really know how the government works. To ask the people, how does the Portland government work? How does the county government? How you should be teaching that in the schools, just like you should be teaching the Constitution and how that works, and so forth, and how, for instance, when you're how did you figure out whether there was fraud in the election? Well, you went to the courts. They went 61, I think, and 60 of them found no fraud. Well, that's the way it's supposed to work. And so you should be teaching that. But I think that we've got it kind of mixed up. We want to make sure we teach all these social things, African American history, Native American history, Latino history. I mean, yes, absolutely, 100%. I'm 100% for it. But it shouldn't be replacing how the government works. And it's pretty hard to understand African American history unless you understand a timeline of history through the world. I mean, if you don't know when World War II was, and you're talking about something that had to do with African American history, how those young men coming back from the war, that had a huge effect on protests and so forth in America. But if you don't know when the war was, then it doesn't fit together unless you can do all of that. And so I don't see them looking at that right now. And it's going to be a problem in the end. Not going to get better to some degree because of that.
Well, as you can see, we've got quite a bit to go from. I want to thank Steve Buel, if you will, who was our main guest today. Again, filling us up in regards to what's happening here locally with our educational system, and also his thoughts about downtown Portland, which is another major area, and also the COVID-19 aspect of it. As you can see, everybody wants a plan. They want to know what are we going to do. And we've got a mayor, in all due respect, he's going to have to get on the ball. And some of the folks who are basically supporting that whole situation are going to have to get on the ball also too. We need a plan. Oregonians need a plan. Portland needs a plan. We can't continue to do this. Hopefully by this summer, we're going to be looking for a plan to get the city of Roses back on the map. So with that, we want to thank you very much for being with us, and we'll see you next week. Okay? Have a good one.